My name is Stuart Balls, the current chair of Writing on the Wall. Welcome to Blackburn House for this event, which forms part of our 18th annual festival here in Liverpool, with this year's festival being themed around the concept of revolution. One or two bits of housekeeping before we start proper. We're not going to have an interval today, but I do want to say that the bar is going to remain open until 9:45. So if people do want to quietly slip out, go to the bar, bring drinks back in, that's perfectly okay with us, with Phil. Please help yourself. The loos, if you need to go through that door there, find your way around to the right-hand side. And for the woman who may have left her mobile phone in the women's loos earlier on, I think Madeline or Mike are holding it at the back, so if you are, yes, and there's a room full of women filling their pockets and looking in their bags around to see if they've got their mobile phones. If you find you haven't got it, then speak to us afterwards. We've got it saved for you. So we're not going to have an interval. Phil is going to talk for around about an hour. Well, that's what he says. And then we're going to have Q&A, and then we're going to have book signings after the event. You should know that here, of course, to support the festival and helping us with the book sales for Phil's books. It's a particular honour to be able to introduce this event tonight. In particular, it's an honour because of the close relationship that Writing on the Wall has developed with tonight's guest over the past decade. Looking back into our archives, it was back in 2007 when we first approached Phil to invite him to speak at a public screening in Anfield of Granada Television's dramatised documentary Hillsborough. Since then, Phil has spoken at numerous Writing on the Wall events. He spoke in 2008 at an event on the demonisation of children within popular culture. In 2009, he spoke on the violence of the state in mental health institutions and in prisons. And then in 2012, he spoke at an event entitled Bearing Witness to the Pain of Others. In 2013, Phil chaired a screening of the film H3 and a discussion of the Irish hunger strike of 1981. And then in the following year, Phil chaired an event on the revival of the Irish language and the particular role of political prisoners in speaking the language and teaching it within their communities once they'd been released from jail. In 2014, Phil took part in a panel discussion on undercover policing, and in 2015, Phil kindly chaired the launch of my book, Writing on the Wall, A Visual History of the Troubles of Northern Ireland. Most recently, Writing on the Wall were particularly proud to host the 2016 launch for the most recent edition of his groundbreaking book, Hillsborough the Truth. So what do all of these events say about Phil? First of all, they show Phil's extraordinary depth of commitment to Writing on the Wall. And I want to thank him for that. But I think it also shows a shared agenda between Phil and our organisation. A shared agenda that focuses on community empowerment and speaking truth to power, as I hope is obvious from the scrutiny of both Phil's work and our festival programmes over the years. But within that, Phil's commitment to Writing on the Wall also shows a belief in reaching out from academia and engaging with those communities that are studied by academics, but where there is too often little reciprocity in terms of providing those communities with the tools that can be used to improve lives or address past injustices. Empowerment is key here. For Phil and for us, marginalised and oppressed groups not merely the objects or even the subjects of study. They are real people. They are groups and communities to be supported, engaged with, and empowered, rather than communities to be observed and reported on. The writing on the wall events that Phil has spoken at have also helped Phil to extend the development of the concept of bearing witness, a concept central to Phil's career as a critical criminologist. His MA dissertation focused on the consequences of institutionalised racism on the Irish travelling community in Liverpool, and his subsequent PhD focused on the use and abuse of police powers in the context of the inner city uprisings of the early 1980s and the 1984 to 1985 miners' strike. All of this is about bearing witness to institutional abuses of power. Phil was the co-founder of Inquest, a charity working for truth, justice and accountability for those bereaved by a death in custody. Phil has also authored research reports and books on police violence and state violence, children's rights, the imprisonment of women, and of course Hillsborough. Alongside this notion of bearing witness, we have a focus on the view from below, a focus on hearing testimonies from marginalised social groups, be they Irish travellers, miners, political prisoners, adults and children in secure environments such as prisons, bail hostels or youth custody centres, or bereaved families and football fans. So that's why we have all ended up here today, to continue this shared journey that so many of us are on with Phil, to work with Phil to bear witness to injustice, to work with Phil to speak truth to power. Truth, a word that trips so lightly off the tongue, but a word that means so much here in Liverpool. So, a big warm welcome back to Writing on the Wall to Phil Scraton, scholar, activist, and now, quite extraordinarily, and not something I thought I would ever say, BAFTA winner.
That was really extraordinary to do. Thank you for such a warm and generous introduction. And it also reminds me that I'm not 35 anymore. And also I was concerned about what I would say tonight, what I had left to say, that people haven't heard before. I did feel kind of compromised by the talk until I thought about how lives are fractured so easily, so dramatically, by single events that can take just a matter of minutes to happen that have consequences for a lifetime. I also felt that dissenting voices are absolutely crucial to all that we should be committed to. I don't hold people to account for not having their voices heard. I have a privileged position. I have a full-time job. I have a decent income. And although from a working class background, I'm the first in my family to go to university, I have a background of support that came from that experience and a way of being able to hopefully articulate both verbally and also on paper the dissent that is felt so deep by so many people. And that's an obligation. For me, it's an obligation. My mother once said to me, whatever you do, don't waste your life. And both my mum and dad died before I was 24. And she never lived to make the judgment on whether or not I have wasted my life, but it stayed with me. And what stayed with me was working with people whose lives have been fractured by the kind of society we live in, that I was brought up in, which in those days was more privileged than it is today. A society in which voices of dissent are absolutely focal and central to our futures, particularly at this moment. Never before have we lived through a time when dissenting voices are more significant and important. Who could have dreamt that somebody like Donald Trump could become President of the United States? Who could have dreamt that, for all the reasons we understand, and in no way am I patronising people, that Brexit would happen in the way it's happened, and would give the Tories a clear run for the foreseeable future. And I'm old enough to remember the last time they had a clear run. And my only hope is that the way they operate in the next years all will come out, because it's for us to recover the truth of what's actually happening in our societies at the moment. Just in this last few days, a group of people that I work with in Belfast came out of the courts in London triumphant, because they're going to get inquests into the deaths of their loved ones after over 40 years. And these are the Ballymounty families. And I'm privileged to know them and to work with them, and I will continue to commit to them. And now they will have the inquests. There should have been their right all those years ago. And they're only inquests. But some of the stories of how their loved ones were killed at the hands over 3 days of the same parachute regiment that went on to commit the atrocity that was Bloody Sunday. That is going to be some day or days in court. But I know those families. And like the Hillsborough families, they're not the families that they were at the time that they lost their loved ones. Many have died prematurely. Some have taken their own lives. Others are very ill. Their sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters have taken up the fight and the struggle for what? For a day in a coroner's court. Something that we would take for granted if our loved ones died in controversial circumstances. And for me, this whole process is about recovering truth. It's all very well for people to say to me now, and they do, oh yeah, we always knew about Hillsborough. Well, a lot of people did know about Hillsborough, but the majority didn't. And the recovery of the truth of Hillsborough took time and patience. It took so long, not just for the families, but for all who supported them. And in the lectures I've given on Hillsborough, I have a slide which is a decade, the fallow decade. Between 2001 and 2009, the 2000s, nobody wanted to know. The programme makers that I rubbed shoulders with down in London at the BAFTA Awards this week didn't want to know. They'd seen Jimmy McGovern's documentary. They'd seen documentaries in Panorama made by Peter Marshall. But they didn't really want to know. Hillsborough was very much yesterday's news in yesterday's decade. And from my point of view, whatever skills I do have, it was important for me to commit to the families and survivors of Hillsborough, whose lives are blighted forever, who will never recover, ever recover. It was an obligation, not out of some great act of kindness or charity, but out of an act of politics, that I should use whatever abilities I have, and they're limited, to work towards the recovery of truth. I believe fundamentally that all truths should be recovered, however long it takes, however many generations it takes. And that's what this evening is about. It's a visit to some of those moments, and some of you will have seen and be familiar with occasional slides that I show. Others will see material for the first time. One of the great insults of last year was when the Oxford Dictionary allowed post-truth to be its word, and it's actually 2 words. So who am I to tell the Oxford Dictionary? They actually privileged the phrase post-truth as its word of the year. What on earth does post-truth mean? An adjective defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion or personal belief. Great if that's a comedian's mantra, great if that's a casual observation. But to think that we got in 2016 to a point where post-truth actually was adopted as the word of the year. And this demonstrates how post-truth came into the collective consciousness gradually over months. Hardly any sign of it in October 2015 in word use in public documents or in newspapers or in magazines. It starts to peak in June 2016. By October 2016, the frequency is nearly off the map. That's how ideologies, that's how words, that's how casual, lazy ways of thinking about the reality of the society in which we live can sneak in to our consciousness. Whether it's on news stories, whether it's on Radio 2, whether it's on local radio, or the one place where I get really aggravated, Radio 4, in the morning, when people, because they have an Oxbridge background, think that they can utter post-truth as some great new discovery. Of course, it isn't a great new discovery, as all of you will recognise. George Orwell demonstrated post-truth absolutely clearly. Think of this. Chuck Todd questioning the President of the United States press officer and advisor. Answer. Why the President asked the White House press secretary to come out and utter a falsehood? Kellyanne Conway. Don't be so overly dramatic. Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that. Alternative facts. 4 of the 5 facts he uttered were not true. Alternative facts are not facts. They are falsehoods. There is no better example of newspeak, no better example of post-truth. And some of you will notice the English nationalist mantra there in George Orwell, 1984, Ingsoc, and his construct of Bellyfield. there was no better example at the height of post-truth than this. When Nigel Farage decided to use this dreadful image adopted from the Second World War and the mass forced migration eventually to the Holocaust. And it's interesting to look back at what those words say. Who flooded European cities after the last war, parasites undermining their host countries and bringing them with them crime, corruption, and chaos. The adoption of this image was in no way by chance. He didn't need to use the words. They were imprinted on people's minds. It wasn't a coincidence. So we return to that Orwellian world of 1984. And the inimitable Steve Bell summed it up far better than I could ever use words to sum it up. That's what it was. He told it like it is. Hating point. And we all know the symbol there on the arm of UKIP and how that symbol suggests Nazism. I wouldn't make that connection to all those people who voted for UKIP, of course I wouldn't. But we're never far away from that which my parents endured. And we're never far away from the hating point that builds so greatly in our society that people are driven from their homes and from their lives and their jobs. It's not just academics and nurses and those who have professional backgrounds who feel threatened, and I work with many of them by this, but all those people who provided the food in the canteen tonight that we ate. Those people who work in lettuce fields and cabbage fields and so on. And I never forget the cockle pickers whose lives were lost on the northwest coast. And of course, when we see an image like this, it appeals to us. A paramedic soldier carrying a drowned child. I'm not using it for an effect. I'm using it directly as a tribute to those who've lost their lives, attempting to escape dreadful war in the Mediterranean. I don't write many words as poems, but as the sea withdrew its twice-daily ebb, golden Mediterranean spans speckled with washed-up cargo. Not for bounty hunters nor trophy seekers, but body bags and unmarked graves. From this well of suffering and fractured lives, politicians seized a callous opportunity. That's my dedication to that child and all of us who have died as a direct consequence of the West's involvement in the East. 1990. And some of you will remember this. Some of you will be being introduced to it for the first time. I've separated the word strange ways for obvious reasons. I've never forgotten that night when I heard of the riot in Strange Ways. I'd not long finished the book with Paula Skidmore and Joe Sim on prisons under protest, where we've been writing about prison riots. And the next day we woke to these kind of headlines. 11 die in jail riots, 12 die, 20 dead, massacre, carnage in the cages. They had imaginations, yeah. And I had a phone call to go Radio 4. And they asked me what I had to say about it as a prison researcher. And I said, I'm dubious, but I don't have any facts. I'm not prepared to speak. And it carried on. I saw 3 lynched in jail horror. Sex prisoners were hanged, tortured, castration fear, iron bar beatings, prison mob, hanged cop, police officer who was doing time in strange ways. Horror jail keeps its secrets. And for 3 weeks, these headlines continued. Send in the SAS. What are we going to do? On the 3rd day, I offered to go into strange ways and mediate. And they said, no, we have our own mediators. The Home Office will look after it. And I said, they won't trust anybody from the Home Office. They might not trust me, but I'm independent. So I'll go in. And I knew that it would be difficult. And they never got back to me. And for those 3 weeks, those men who were up on the roof, and you'll see a banner there that says no deaths. They are up on the roof. And our society believed that these prison protesters had killed people, that they put them through kangaroo courts, that they'd taken them to the edge of the landings, they'd strung them up, they'd hung them, cut them down, butchered their bodies, and pushed the bodies down the sewers. Our society believed that story. It never happened. It never happened. Alternative facts, post-truth. It's a figment, not of imagination, but of reality. Our historic reality. How easy it is when those people are so distant from our lives that we can believe that they could do this kind of damage to each other, high on drugs, raiding the drug cabinets, all the rest. Anyone who has any knowledge of a prison knows that the main drug that's held in a drug cabinet is a sedative. You don't get amphetamine in drug cabinets. In 2003, I wrote this. These events did not happen. No prisoners were hung, no summary executions, no one had been butchered, no one castrated. Media silence following realization that the gory details had been fabricated, that reporters and editors had been duped by uninformed official reports and off-the-record briefings by prison guards and their association, was in marked contrast to the frenzy of the initial reporting. Yet the Strange Ways massacre ran for weeks. Unattributed allegations, inducements to those willing to offer false eyewitness accounts remained uncontested by officials, those very officials I'd spoken to, who had access to the prison throughout. It's a stain. It's a stain on our history that has never been fully righted. That we can believe that a man who only had 4 months of a sentence to serve took to the roof, knowing that he would be charged with riot. He had nowhere to go, knowing that he would get a longer sentence. He got 10 years. High on drugs. The real clue was the state of Strange Ways, was the violation of human rights of prisoners, was the dreadful conditions in which they were held, the lack of opportunity. Our society has a recidivism rate of nearly 80%, set against Scandinavia of 20%. Who's getting incarceration right? And I'm going to revisit has always been difficult in my home city, I'm going to revisit the killing of James Bulger. Most of you know the story, or think you have a version of the story, and I won't insult your intelligence to suggest that what you think and what you believe is wrong. And I'm not going to talk about the killing of James Bulger per se. What we did know, and what we've always known, is 2 young children were responsible for his abduction. But they were 2 10-year-olds were arrested in a Malé which had seen many arrested and treated dreadfully, where some families who'd been completely innocent were never able to return to their homes. And these 2 10-year-olds were held in virtual solitary confinement. This could not happen in any other European state. And they were held in solitary confinement for 9 months and received no counselling, no support, because to be given counselling could have interfered with the prosecution, because yes, these 2 10-year-olds were charged with murder and then prosecuted in an adult court, where the seats had to be raised so they could see over the bar, where every hour they were taken from the court to play with toys in a side room. They were found guilty and imprisoned at Her Majesty's pleasure. That's not what I'm really focusing on. I have my own views from the deep knowledge of the case about what happened on that fateful day. What I want to focus on is a decision by one of the most senior judges in Britain to disclose their identities, allowing the media to publish their photographs. Unprecedented and unique. It's remained unique. They were actually beneath the age of criminal prosecution. Dina, my partner, who's here, and I, in Scandinavia, visited situations where similar cases had happened. And where those children were returned to their schools, returned to their communities with full support. Silje Riedegard's mother, what did she say? When we said, but wouldn't you have wanted them to go to prison? She was incredulous. But they are only children. But aside from the case, this is what I'm really concerned about. What I'm concerned about is the way the notion of truth was reconstructed. Not to say that these children had difficulties or problems, and let's remember, no one foresaw it. No one, they've never shown any signs of even misbehaviour in their classes. They've not sacked schools. But the media, once their identities were out, could call them freaks of nature, that could accuse them and their families, not only that they committed an act, which I would debate with anybody in terms of the construct of murder, but not only that they committed an act, but they were born to murder. That they had some inherent gene that meant that one day, if they ever came into each other's company, those genes would be triggered and they would kill. Who writes this pseudo-psychology? Who writes this bunkum? Cunning and very wicked, an act of unparalleled evil. The judge had every right to make his pronouncement. But knowing that those photographs were going to be published, and those boys were going to try and have some form of rehabilitation into the lives of those boys, this was irresponsible. It was dreadful. And it's a hard thing for us to accept. but 3 lives were lost. Of course they are both alive today, but those moments define their lives. And again, any kind of a sensitive, supportive society should try to make something positive out of what was a tragic, dreadful, awful occasion. It went further than that. For those of you who are not old enough to remember it or weren't around at the time, Sunday Times. Gerald Warner. Sullen, introverted, ignorant and loutish, our nation of vipers have been bred on the back of 2 boys taking the life of a child. Janet Daly, immoral, childish viciousness, horrible, precisely to the degree it was childlike. Oh, so this is childlike behavior. Random, aimless, without conscience. How dare she suggest that children have no conscience? Where does that come from? How do you take one single case and elevate it to all children? Your children, my children. How can you do that? Very easily. The editorial in the Sunday Times didn't hold back. It went for a quasi-religious metaphor. The mark of the beast might not also be imprinted on their offspring. They were talking about people fearing that they might have a child who might commit an act like this. How would they know? The mark of the beast. And in the Sunday Times also, and notice I'm not dealing with tabloids, Walter Ellis, renowned journalist. We can never know which of them has the Satan bug inside him. The Satan bug. Beryl Bainbridge, one of ours. Devoid of innocence, she said, when she got off the train at Lime Street and saw the children outside. On the concourse, she said, there she saw children devoid of innocence, old beyond their years, and undeniably corrupt. How dare she? Women wondered, which women? If they should have been drowned at birth. I had some issue about putting this quote in, because a few years later, Beryl Bainbridge chose Hillsborough Truth as one of the 3 books of the year. Linda Lee Potter, A Nightmarish World, where children growing up virtually as savages. Those of you who remember that time will remember the pressures that were on school teachers, youth workers, the incredible backlash that took an exceptional case and treated it as a stereotypical case. It was atypical, and yet it became the conduit for legislation, the Crime and Disorder Act, all that came after that. It became a conduit for changes that we're now seeing the consequences of in all our societies in terms of the regulation of children and young people. And our research for the book Childhood in Crisis demonstrates that absolutely clearly, that period between the early 90s and through to the 2000s. And yet it was based on post-truth assumptions. So what am I talking about? To be academic about it for a second, I'm talking about media representations of crime, of how we are fed through the media, all media, our knowledge and understanding of what crime is. Some of us feel it in our communities, around us, we see it on the street. Some of us have been survivors of crime. I understand that. But in terms of the social world, social construction of a general morality, and the social construction of a general reality, we rely on media representations in all forms of media. And in that, politicians know it only so well. That whole construction of crime that depends specifically on political opportunism. and the public outrage that it generates. If it's for me, I'm not here. The public outrage that it actually generates. When we show these headlines to those who worked with children and young people in Scandinavia, even to the chiefs of police, they couldn't believe them. They couldn't accept them. It was beyond their comprehension that a society could respond to children and young people in that way. The idea that they are evil individuals, dysfunctional families, pathological communities. This is a throwback to late 19th century criminology and biological determinism that melds into psychological determinism. And the state responses have been marked through this time. The phrase zero tolerance, which had been used by the women's movement in terms of zero tolerance against women, was hijacked. There will be zero tolerance of children's unruly behaviour. Not criminal behaviour, unruly behaviour. The new entry into ASBO land. And let's just remember for 1 minute, ASBOs were not created to be directed towards children. They were directed towards adults. And they would only be directed towards children under the legislation if they were in the company of adults. But ASBOs soon became a metaphor for children's unruly behaviour and for the surveillance that then happened in communities and schools and on the street. Not just the police, but social workers as policing, community workers as policing, people working with young people as policing, regulation, and the way in which targeting developed. I haven't put the slide on the mosquito devices, but the idea that you can invent and sell to local authorities a device that sends out such a high frequency noise that only children can hear it, and to put it around shops and in arcades, so children would be cleared away by the impenetrable noise that was going through their heads. And 1 or 2 places withdrew them because women couldn't take, it would be mostly women, babies, in their prams into those areas because their areas are particularly sensitive. You grow out of it about 17 or 18. Who would have thought that that kind of indiscriminate regulation could be used in a society committed to young people and to children? Crime and antisocial behaviour stretched the legislation. So now, antisocial behaviour, not in a criminal court but in a civil court, could be directed against children on the balance of probabilities. The issues around inadequate parents, problem communities. I work in those communities. I know there are issues of adequacy. Of course I do. I know there are issues of parental drug taking. I know there are issues of joblessness and homelessness. I know there are issues of problems in those communities. Of course I do. I see it in the work I do. But zero tolerance, the big stick, was this the way to handle those issues? No. And what we saw as a direct consequence was an elevation of imprisonment, with young offenders institutions going to record levels in terms of incarceration, with no alternatives in communities to help those in youth work and those who are responsive to the needs of children and young people do their work. There is a direct correlation between the increase in youth imprisonment in our society and the decrease in funding essential youth work in communities. You don't have to be a mathematical genius to work it out. So regulation, control, policing, and ultimately prison Look at the growth of prison rates in our society. Doubled in 20 years, at a time when the crime rate has been reduced by 40%. That has nothing to do with what works. It has everything to do with punishment and punitivity. What about post-truth Hillsborough? And for those of you who found what I've just said to be uncomfortable, I don't think anybody will find post-truth Hillsborough to be uncomfortable, because we now all together stand united. But we didn't. We all know Calvin Mackenzie. And this city, more than anywhere, knows the consequences, rightly so, that have been suffered and endured by the Son. As somebody once commented, why did we ever believe in the Son in the first place? But having said that, we all know this wasn't about Calvin Mackenzie. It was partly about Calvin Mackenzie. The one thing that was about Calvin Mackenzie was the headline. You scum. You scum was the headline that he preferred. His political editor talked him into using the truth. And you all know the story. That fans picked pockets of the victims, urinated on the brave cops, beat fans up, gave them a piece of life. And one of the Hicks daughters was sexually assaulted as her body was passed down. But I'm not giving Calvin Mackenzie the Son any leeway. But that story was run in 6 newspapers on the same day. And that story had credibility from the Daily Mail right the way through to the Star and other what we would call broadsheets. The Mirror was the exception. Dead fans robbed by drunk thugs. Vile fans fought us as we tried to help the dying. Police accused drunken fans. Sick spectacle of pilfering from the dying. Liverpool pickpockets pounced on the dead. Yobs sex jives over girl's corpse. Imagine being the Hicks parents and reading that. Heavy drinking fans besieged ground. The Sun didn't stand alone in the story. Yes, they were the worst offender. But this was collective. On that Wednesday, this was collective. And I spent the next 20-odd years determined to find where that story had come from. Of course, I had my inclination, but in my work, inclination isn't good enough. This is the moment. This is the moment that the lie begins to be told. The day after the disaster, Margaret Thatcher, on the terraces where 96 people died. You'll see 2 in from the right with a kind of ridiculous grin on his face. Her press secretary. And between her press secretary and her is the chief constable. Chief constable from here, one of ours, who is now working in Sheffield. There's Douglas Hurd, and all the other dignitaries, etc. And just behind her right hand, and I don't think it's a salute, just behind her hand is the chairman, of Hillsborough. The chairman of Sheffield Wednesday Football Club. How do I know? Those of you who've seen me speak before know the answer. How do I know what was being said at that moment? Pretty simple, really. Because Bernard Ingham, He's not as bright as he thinks he is. He wrote to us, I visited Hillsborough on the morning after the disaster. I know what I learned on the spot. We've just seen the spot. There would have been no Hillsborough if a mob who were clearly tanked up had not tried to force their way into the ground. To blame the police as a cop-out, I see no purpose in addressing an organisation, he's talking about the Liverpool City Council, which is incapable of accepting this simple fact. That's what he learned on the spot. That's what was being said to them at that moment. Before they went to the hospital, before they went to visit some of those people in hospital who I've grown to know and love. I mean, imagine having just survived a disaster and you wake up with Margaret Thatcher standing right and in that situation, Bernard Ingram let the cat out of the bag. But the lie didn't stop there. It was disseminated. It moved on. This was the day that I decided that the Hillsborough Project would be founded. Sheffield style. Up to 40 people died in the tunnel, the rest trampled underfoot. Thousands of fans began the fatal charge. Lakecomers tried to force their way into the ground. Manchester Evening News, the Anfield Army charged onto the terrace behind the goal, many without tickets. The Standard in London, the catastrophe was caused by violent enthusiasm, tribal passions of Liverpool supporters. Tribal passions of Liverpool supporters who literally killed themselves. Gate crashers wreaked their fatal havoc. Uncontrolled fanaticism. Mass hysteria. Scouse killed Scouse. Yes, look at the newspaper that published that in our own city. Liverpool can't accept that some of its troubles might have something to do with its own people. Self-pity, work shy. They're talking about me. They're talking about many of you. They're talking about my family. They're talking about people who died in a disaster. How did it switch in a few days from national empathy and sympathy to condemnation? How did that happen? And it went on, lived on. As Brian Clough, who was there, who saw the pens with his own eyes, who spoke to Kenny Dalglish. And before he died, Kenny Dalglish had something to say back to him. Liverpool people kill Liverpool people. Half can't read, and the other half are out pinching hubcaps. I mean, this would be some parody from Harry Enfield if it wasn't actually serious. And by the way, what Harry Enfield does to Liverpool is serious in its own right. Simon Heffer, a renowned columnist in the Sunday Telegraph. Liverpool fans were killed by the thuggishness and ignorance of other Liverpool fans. Jonathan Marjolis, writing in the Sunday Times, a really well-respected journalist, writing a very long article, called us self-pity city. Liverpool culture seems to combine defeatism and hollow-cheeked depression with a cloying mawkishness. So, like the Bulger case, we've gone from a single event that happened over a short period of time to condemning a whole city and environment. Auburn Wall, one of the War family. Can't give him war. Liverpool's unemployment is due to stupidity as much as the unpleasant habits of the people. The clever people left long ago. I wrote to him and told him to move to Belfast. But that was the way in which it was mobilised. This isn't something that happens overnight. It happens over a period of time. It builds an image. It builds an identity. And that identity is damaging and it's negative. and on. Let's move on from the newspaper reports. They're coming after 3 or 4 years, those last ones. This is David Cohen writing in a respectable book on the aftermath of disasters and tragedy. He thinks he has the right to analyse Hillsborough and the aftermath as indicative of Liverpool's darkest side. Massive drugs problems, endemic unemployment, mass disorder. That's not enough. The hallmarks of Neanderthal man. I mean, you couldn't write this stuff, but he did. In a textbook. And I've got a stack of these. And then Boris. Dear Boris, who's not so dear. Tribal sense of community, a predilection for welfarism, deeply unattractive psyche. God, I'd love to meet him. Mindlessly tried to fight their way into the ground. Police became a convenient scapegoat, the son a whipping boy. He even got the numbers of dead wrong. And this isn't in the immediate aftermath. This is after he's built his reputation. This is more recent. This is years on. Ian Jack, who some of you will read in Saturday's Guardian. The victims were said to have died for football, not died in vain. Thus Liverpool learned, notice, Liverpool learned to dramatise itself, to show its stigmata. Look at my hands, they bleed. Look at my feet, they bleed. Look, somebody stabbed me in the side. That's my stigmata. What kind of metaphors are these? How dramatic are they? How do they impact on our understanding of truth? And some of you might not appreciate this next part of the talk. In my other work, how do you feel about prisoners? Some of you might have been in prison, some of you will have visited prison. Well, I want to talk about the prisoners I've known all the years, since I first went into prison and taught a class in Walton when I was 23 years old. Yeah, long hair. Regulation collarless shirt, waistcoat, right to work badge. I didn't understand what prison officers things to take to me. And going into the prison, I learned something, and I've been in prisons almost every year since. And we wrote the book, Jude McCulloch, who is a wonderful, brilliant academic in Australia. We wrote the book relatively recently, The Violence of Incarceration. And we chose the front cover carefully. While we were up in arms about what was happening in Guantanamo Bay, what was happening beneath Guantanamo Bay in ordinary prison cells was equally as questionable. I haven't time to give the full analysis from the book, but I'll let my good mate, recently died, well, yes, in my mind, Nelson Mandela, to say it. Prison is designed to break one's spirit and destroy one's resolve. To do this, the authorities attempt to exploit every weakness, demolish every initiative, negate all signs of individuality, all with the idea of stamping out that spark that makes each of us human and each of us who we are. That level of aggressive conformity that takes away the essence of who you are. I don't know most of the people in this room, but I can tell you now I respect you for your creativity, for your understanding, for the way you actually see the world. Well, as long as you agree with me, right? But I respect that, and I respect it entirely. Why? Because everyone in this room is an individual. That's what we pride ourselves in. That's what we pride each other in, our individuality. That spark that makes each of us human and each of us who we are. Sometimes I write quotes or use quotes because I couldn't write it better myself. Prisons are total institutions. They're joined by the umbilical cord or umbilical cord of those vans, those white vans with the little windows and little tiny cells, as they run between the courts and the prison and the prison and the prison. The prison is a total institution. Don't give me the stuff about television in cells. There's no reason for that. If you're locking somebody up for 23 hours out of 24, you stick a television in the cell. Yeah? It's pretty simple, really. It's not for their benefit. They don't even choose the programs. Don't give me the stuff about 3 meals a day, although the sad factor about our life is that there are people who have to go into prison because they don't get 3 meals a day, and they go in for crimes of poverty. Don't give me the stuff about it being a cushy life. Try it. Try it in your own home. Lock yourself in your bedroom for 3 days and see how it feels, with a potty to go to the toilet in and a canvas gown to wear. The prison is an island, as Solzhenitsyn said, and what we witness as a prison archipelago of all those prisons that link to each other. Why should we be concerned? Well, some of you will be concerned because you've either been in prison or you visit people in prison. I'm concerned because they don't work, and because of the damage they do, and the hurt and the pain and the suffering to families that we see visiting their loved ones in prison. And don't again give me the argument, well, they shouldn't have committed the crime. Most of the people in our prisons would not be in a prison in most European societies. They would be given the support and the help that they actually need in their community. Their families would be given that support. The pains of confinement. Erving Goffman, the great sociologist, years ago wrote something that I read when I was at university. In the language of some of our oldest total institutions, the prisoner begins a series of abasements, degradations, humiliations, and profanations of self. The breaking of who you are. The barrier the total institutions placed between the prisoner and the wider world marks the first curtailment of self. It is destructive. As we wrote in the Prisons Under Protest book, trying to make sense of why prisoners, knowing that they're going to have a 4-month sentence extended to 10 years, actually revolt. The totality of the institution is underwritten by a degree of totality or absolutism in power relations, which strip the prisoner of civil rights, personal consultation, and democratic process. How does that help anybody resettle back into society? And in case we think we can duck what our responsibilities about prison, that we can pass by one on the other side of the road as if it's just a wall. Tough team. I played for the university in Walton Prison against the prison team. It was so hard and it was great. They were so fit, they'd been in the gym the whole time. I still got the bruises. Richard Quinney, the great American criminologist, says, separating people through the institution of the prison creates populations of incomplete and wounded lives, whether we are inside the prison or outside the prison. This is the dance of the slave and the slaveholder, the inmate and captor, the prisoner and non-prisoner. No one escapes the damage caused by the fact that prison exists. It is, he says, pervasive, economic, social, psychological, and spiritual. The injuries caused by the prison are shared by all. They have consequences in our communities. They have consequences for us, directly. The pains of confinement, I would argue, therefore, inflicted in our name, financed by you and me through the public purse, but beyond the economic costs, are more profound consequences, social, political, and emotional. And that money, at £80,000 a year per head prisoner, could be put to so much better use for the majority of those prisoners in the community. So again, post-truth, as a time when we're shopping the budgets for essential mental health care, and we transfer over 600 prisoners from prison into mental health institutions each year, at that time when we need most to be building proper community support. And I know some of you will say, well, Phil, hang on, what do you do with murderers? I'm not talking about murderers. I'm talking about the majority of our prison population. The vast majority. The revolving door. I know them, I meet them, I see them come out with nowhere to go, sleeping in bus shelters. 2 days later, they're back in prison. They are the consequences for our society. And £80,000 spent on that individual? What could we do with that? At a time when mental health care is being cut in our communities, essential services are being cut in our communities, you don't have to be a genius to work it out. And this isn't a political rally. This isn't a political statement. This is economic common sense from analysis and experience of those troubled people. And of course, their troubles are mine. In case any of you haven't spotted it, it's a line from the Christy Moore song on the Armagh women in Northern Ireland during the conflict. Your troubles are not mine. They are. I was put in a hospital bed for 9 days. They brought over here the punishment block, segregation block, one night. That night I tried to hang myself and they wouldn't take me back over. I hear voices and see things. The voices tell me to do them, self-harm. And I realise the pain as well. It's terrible solitude. You sleep and you make changing positions. Just look at the way they make me go to the toilet in a little potty. It's for night time. It's a disgrace. They don't give me underwear or nothing. It's hard. This young woman, 16, in a canvas gown, no Velcro, held together with sellotape. They just give you a wee sanitary towel and that's it. How does she use the sanitary towel? I asked her permission before I asked the question. I was doing the work of Linda Moore. She said, I just hold it tight between my legs. It's hard, just stuck in the cell with a camera. No privacy or nothing, your dignity taken away. They just said, it's your own fault. Get behind the door. The next morning, dressed actually in blue jeans and an open neck shirt, I found myself called to court. And we had her released from those conditions before the end of the day. And she was released into the community later that week. How could she have possibly been helped by being in those conditions? At the end of the day, I know that if anything happens to me, there'll be an investigation. I never ripped the mattress or the blanket. I couldn't rip them. They were indestructible. Nor did I block the spine, the little spy hole. So if I take, these are her words, if they take pneumonia, it's all come out. I think you can only last 10 to 12 days without drinking. Because then you dehydrate and your kidneys go. I have no intention of eating or drinking again. So they're beat there. I know that all would be dead. But I'd sure make sure everything is revealed first. That was the last letter she ever wrote. She took her own life the next week. And Francis. It's very rare that prisoners write a diary. Time to die. Today has been an okay week and day, except this evening the voices are getting really bad. You all know what that is a reference to. I can't put up with them anymore. There was a code blue tonight on the wee lads in Elm. Code blue is when someone has hung themselves and died. So we're locked all night. If these voices keep up, there will be another code blue tonight. I already have a noose made and ready, but I can't do anything until the night staff do the alarms. Then I have an hour. I've got it planned, and tonight is the night. And tonight was the night. And what we face in our society is a deceit of penal reformism. Our research identifies the unmet needs of women prisoners against a backdrop of violence and restraint, strip searching, systemic denial of bodily integrity, self-harm, segregation, appalling physical and mental health care in the context of facilities shared with men, punitive detox programs, minimal contact with families and children, bereavement, inadequate preparation for release, and authoritarian, poorly trained guards. We wrote this several years ago, and even with new recruitment and graduate entry, little has changed. We published it in 2014 in our book, The Incarceration of Women. This is work that is investigative and revelatory. It takes me right back to my introductory comments. It bridges the inside-outside physical divide by informing the outside, you, the people around me in my community, on BBC and ITV, of what happens on the inside. It achieves the view from below, that downtrodden view from below, and nobody knows better than people in this city of what the view from below really means. By the view from within, from behind the walls. This is not some television program for our laughs and enjoyment and predilection, or the current spate of documentaries, always guided by the prison service, always restrained by the Official Secrets Act. All I can do in this work is to bear witness and write about it. So, how do we know what we know? Some of you will have heard me talk about this before. The Henry Reynolds question, why weren't we told? As he flies from Tasmania, where he's brought up, where he goes to university to work as a teacher in the Northern Territories. And he goes into the classroom for the first time, and he meets the Aboriginal issue head on. And someone said, you think it's bad here? Get down to the local cop shop. So he goes down to the police station. He finds two little girls, sisters, Aboriginal girls, with a piss-stained mattress, broken shards of glass all around them. And he says to the police officer, why aren't they here? Why are they here? Because they weren't behaving in class. They weren't behaving in class. This is 1966. This is the time when Aboriginal rights were growing up the agenda in Australia. And he committed himself to the truth at that moment. He wrote the book, Why Weren't We Told? His work as a historian, a social historian, and now as a professor, his work has been absolutely remarkable in the way it has shone a light on Australian society, that society that those of us who are fortunate enough to have flown there love when we visit. Try going to the reservations. So, what he's asking the question, why weren't we told? He's asking about the status of reliable information. I remember starting my degree at Liverpool University and being told that, social research was scientific. It's also political. Because, as Michel Foucault points out, it connects into society's power, the power relations that are intrinsic to our society, the social, political, economic power relations, the way our history is written and interpreted. And that takes us into ideology and the ideological construction of who we are historically. And of course he uses the phrase, regimes of truth. Regimes of truth. Lies don't happen by chance. There are regimes that are constructed around us, the professional regimes, the lie of the law of medicine, where truth is retold in different ways to avoid liability. And it's what the late, wonderful John Berger the artist said, these are ways of seeing. These are ways of seeing that we learn, that we share in our communities. These are our prejudices. But there is intellectual collusion in that. That is coming supported directly by our universities, our colleges, and the millions of books that are published every year to demonstrate those ways of seeing. Fortunately, there are alternative discourses. There are dissenting accounts. There are those discourses which challenge that status quo. That's how I see my own work. That's how I define myself. A dissenting voice that seeks out alternative discourses. But to do that, I have to be there. We all have views on prisons. I have to be in a prison to know a prison. I had to work with the families and survivors of Hillsborough to know their experiences, not to feel like them. I couldn't. I didn't lose anybody at Hillsborough, but to understand. We can all have views about the Bulger case, but we need to be there to understand it, to strip it back, to take away the pub sociology, the pub discourse, to understand more deeply and profoundly that which happens. For the majority of people in England particularly, where I live now should have been pushed out into the Atlantic and sunk many years ago. They didn't want to know about Northern Ireland. It was 6 counties, not the 9 that it should have been, 6 counties. But I even say that, not the 9 that it should have been, that the border was gerrymandered to ensure a Protestant majority. And that whole process of not having full powers until 1949, most of us don't know that. Most of us don't know what the endurance of Northern Ireland has been. Interned without trial 5 times between 1922 and eventually when over 1,000 men and women were interned without trial. Locking people up for who they are in the early 1970s. To understand it, we have to be there. We have to bear witness. I had my position on the north of Ireland. People couldn't tell me about sectarianism. My dad was a Liverpool Protestant. My mum was a Birkenhead Catholic. And when they married, his family never spoke to him again, not even when he died. And I know there'll be people in this room who can tell similar stories. It's not about me, but that is indicative of how that division, which is not a division just about religion, it's about imperialism and the history of imperial rule. I have to be there to bear witness. When we moved to the north of Ireland, I hesitate, it's 16 years, nearly 16 years ago. I knew that if I was going to research, if we were going to research, we had to give ourselves time to understand this very complex society before we had a right to analyse and discuss. And I've left our work out tonight because I don't have time. But as an outsider to a place that I often feel an insider, I'm proud of what we've achieved during a period in which a peace process has developed. And some people will come up to me tonight, I know, and I don't blame you for it, and say, are people still being shot on the streets? Do the IRA still, are there still roadblocks? Of course not. Of course not. Oh, but we see this on, of course we see it on the tab. We see all sorts of stuff on the tab. But that's not the reality of living in one of the most peaceful places. I can tell you, after I had death threats over Hillsborough, one of the great things about moving to Northern Ireland was safety. It's about being there and bearing witness. It's about breaking the silence. It's about the view from below. The view that we all know and feel, but we need to take time to discover and uncover. About bearing witness, about hearing testimonies, recording them and reporting them. About recovering the truth. That's what that BAFTA is about. It's not about the lovies in London and the champagne and all that goes with it. It's actually about the recognition that after those years, one documentary, after Jimmy's and after Peter's, one documentary above all recovered the truth for everyone to hear. The truth that many of us in this city knew because we knew people. But now the world listened. It's about challenging the deceit that we saw in those headlines at the beginning of this tour. But it's also, and I'm not doing a very good job of it at the moment, it's about containing our emotion. Emotion is useless for me as an analyst. Emotion is useless for me. I can be driven by emotion, but when I sit at my desk, when I sit down to do my research, I have to control that emotion. I have to be sure that I'm right, because I can tell you now, I only have to be wrong once for all of that work to be destroyed. And I knew that and carried that all through Hillsborough for all those 20 plus years. When I'd sit at our kitchen table and I didn't have the material to write that final chapter on the media, and then it dropped through the door like so much else had come. I don't know where it came from. It dropped through the door. And I opened it. And there it was. There it was, White's news agency, approached by two senior police officers, Irving Patnick, the MP for Sheffield, and Paul Middoff, the chair of the Police Federation. There it was. They were the conduit for the Sun. I knew all along that Kelvin Mackenzie wouldn't have taken the risk, nor would the other editors. They took that material as fact, and they set back and they set back the campaign and created one of the great miscarriages of justice that infected all that came afterwards and infected people's consciousness, even within the city. But for me to do that work, for me to understand it, I have to get up from my seat, stamp on the floor, put on a bit of Eddie Reader, pour myself a cup of tea, and contain my emotion. Otherwise, what I write, what I understand, is neither use nor ornament. And critical research is about digging beneath the surface of appearances, asking how social systems really work, how ideology and history conceal the processes, as Lee Harvey says, critiquing that which we've always thought was scientific knowledge, but knowledge that sustains oppressive structures. I want to put this in because Catherine's here tonight. It rejects the premise that knowledge is value-free or value-neutral, but derived and reproduced in the structural relations of a society that accepts inequality and oppression, and also that characterises established social orders. That's what critical research is about. That's what it does. That's what critical media discourse has to do. It has to dig beneath the surface of appearances. It has to unpack established social orders. It's about disclosure. In Power, Conflict and Criminalisation, I argued it's about context. It's about locating moments, events, responses within those structural determinants that surround us. We don't see them, we don't think about them, but they are there. It's about, as C. Wright Mills many years ago, 1959 to be precise, talked about as personal troubles. We all have them. But those personal troubles within those damning contexts are understood and explained in the structural relations of social and historical conditions. We understand history not as a pastime, but as an informing category of how we got to where we are. And what the late wonderful Stan Cohen talked about when he talked about troubling recognitions that previously have been denied, neutralised, he says, or reconstructed. My role is the disclosure and dissemination of information that makes us feel uncomfortable. Troubling information. How many times have people said to me, Phil, that's just too far. I don't believe that. That couldn't have happened. Really? I don't blame people for that. I know people are responsible for that. But I'm nobody special at all. Everyone has the capacity to understand troubling information and dig deeper. At a time when I go to pick up a BAFTA and find myself standing next to Anton Deck. I really want to understand the intellectual value of what these guys do. They're doing well. And I'm not a snob. But come on, give me a break. This is the responsibility of the critical researcher. It's investigative. It's revelatory. It's the view from below. The view that you know, that I know, that you know could happen to you. And there are people in this room who tragedy has damaged forever. And I know that. And every single other one of us could be that. Every one of us. It has no boundaries. It has no class. It has no ethnicity. It has no religion. When that happens to us, who do we turn to? How do we disclose? For me, it's been a long journey. And I'm beginning to feel my age. 48. And it's not that funny. And what is research to me? It's not just research. I'm not interested in telling you how many cornflakes there are in a packet and how long it takes you to eat it, or you. I'm concerned about truth recovery, about bearing witness, about disclosing abuse that could happen to any of us and does. The C. Wright Mills principle of turning public personal troubles into public issues. We all know that it happens at random. What happened in this city over several months when the Liverpool-born black community was held hostage by police forces from all over the UK. What happened in the mining communities a few years later in exactly the same kind of way. They were happening in those communities to people like you and me. For me, that's a public issue. It's not just that personal trouble. And for me, the responsibility is to commit to building alternative accounts. That's how we discover truth. But truth isn't enough. I'm not interested in people going to jail. I'm an abolitionist. What I'm interested in is official acknowledgement. That they got it wrong. And they got it wrong big time. I'll leave it to others to say what should happen to them. For me, it's about the acknowledgement to those who've been harmed, that their harm was committed by gross acts of negligence, neglect, or deliberately. It's about dealing with state institutions to do that. Revealing the contradictions that exist within those state institutions. To use the law backwards against those state institutions. It took us a hell of a long time, but that's exactly what we did with Hillsborough. It's about using international standards, those awful, dreadful places that we're trying to get away from, that we're trying to Brexit out of. Using those international standards that could be used to protect us. But it's about also building activist alliances. None of us can do this work individually. None of us is an island. and with my partner, Dina Hayden, way back in 2002, in an article on rights and equality, we argued that there has to be a fundamental shift in the structural relations and the determining context of power, which marginalise and exclude us from effective participation on the grounds of class, race and ethnicity, age, gender, sexuality, all of those forms of oppression, that it is our responsibility not only to expose, but to fight against. Thanks for listening.